Ian Lesser, and Senior Fellow and Head of the Geopolitics team at the German Marshall Fund, Ms. Christine Berzinia.
Good morning, and welcome back to the second day of the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum. We are happy to have you here to look more at the challenges. Yesterday was day one, and we were looking at what is important in the transatlantic community today. The war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, what to do about it, was front and center, and other aspects that are related. What do we do about the energy crisis? How do we solve the situations we put ourselves in? And we're looking at this from a perspective of a call to action. We're not just here to gripe. We're here to be motivated, to take the next steps forward, and to feel as though we are the agents of courage. We are the agents of change, very much as the Marshall Plan was an agent of change here in Europe.
Christine, thanks very much. And so we're going to shift gears slightly, actually quite a bit, this morning, and we're going to start talking about the global economy, where there are no shortage of challenges, as you know, whether it's inflation or it's global supply chain disruptions or labor dislocations, both short-term, immediate challenges that we face and long-term perspectives. And we have a wonderful group to discuss that with us today. But to moderate that conversation, I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague, Jacob Kierkegaard, who is here with us in Brussels as a senior fellow, GMF, and the Peterson Institute. Jacob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, it's once again, what can I say? It's the economy, stupid, this morning. And we're going to talk a little bit about the global economy. I think it's fair to say we've got interstate war, we've got inflation, that's at least two of the four macroeconomic horsemen, if you like. But it's wonderful we have a perfect panel with us to do it today. So I would like to introduce Maria de Mertzes and John B. Emerson. Maria is the Deputy Director of Bruegel, which is, I think it's fair to say, the best-known economic think tank in Brussels. She also has a background in central banking. The Commission central banking will be useful for this conversation, and also has academic credentials from Harvard and the University of Strathclyde. John B. Emerson, former US Ambassador to Germany, Clinton White House, going back to the economy, board member of, I dare say, German Marshall Fund, among many other things, but first and foremost, of course, Vice Chair of the Capital Group International.
Hold your applause, please.
Yes. But basically, I think that the basic question that most people have about the global economy is really quite simple. It's always about fear. So the question is, what do we fear most? Right now, global recession or inflation? Or do we have one and then the other? Is it inevitable? Where are we?
Inflation, for sure. You can see it in the numbers. You try and put fuel back in your car, and the first thing you see is that the bill has doubled. And actually, since September, it went up to doubling. Then it came back to sort of 75%. Then it went doubled again. So, yeah, inflation is definitely the biggest problem right now. And then there is, of course, the potential of a recession, but only a potential recession.
That is the optimistic spin.
Well, you know, if you look at the global economy today, we've got 5 things happening simultaneously. First of all, before February 24th, we already were dealing with inflation as a consequence of supply-demand imbalance coming out of COVID and some of the structural changes that were being made in supply chains by companies as they were moving from just-in-time inventory management to just-in-case inventory management, and as governments were beginning to focus more on national security implications of supply chains. Think semiconductors, think pharmaceuticals. Secondly, we heard yesterday from the CEO of Exxon that energy markets were already tight, and we were seeing price increases there before February 24th. And then, of course, bam, Russian invasion, oil embargo, Russia weaponizing energy, and you know, we now heard many times yesterday in terms of potential shutting off of gas to Europe. Winter is coming. How many times did we hear that phrase yesterday? Thank you, Game of Thrones. And you know, friends of mine in Germany have been receiving indications from the gas companies that their gas bill will triple as of August 1st. Third, food security. There was already a global food security crisis before February 24th, and now we have Russia weaponizing grain and fertilizer. Fourth, central banks, which I know we're going to get into, their ability to deal with this is somewhat constrained. They're going to have to address inflation, and they're clearly prioritizing inflation over growth. And then finally, you have the economic model that has worked so well for Germany and worked so well for Europe, which is basically America defends us, Russia gives us cheap oil and gas, and we make great stuff that we sell to the Chinese. Well, that's broken. You know, Europe is going to have to start spending more on defense. They're going to, you know, obviously energy is costing a lot more. And we really got to start thinking, do we want the kind of dependency on China that we've had on Russia for a period of time? So, yes, inflation first, but it's a very, very complicated situation.
Okay, but if it's inflation first, then we got to talk about central banks. On the one hand, we've clearly, I think it's fair to say we have a Federal Reserve that has clearly said, look, it's going to be inflation first. If it takes a recession, so be it. On the other hand, we've got a Bank of Japan that has just bought over 50%, is actually into the second half of all outstanding Japanese bonds. And then the big question, of course, here in Europe is, well, what about the European Central Bank? It has obviously been tiptoeing about its communication, but has signaled we're going to have a liftoff. I just saw they pushed back the announcement by 30 minutes yesterday by pushing their but basically, Maria, what should they do? How do we deal with this specific, once again recurring, if you like, design problem in the euro area? We got inflation. They can't just do whatever they want on the stimulative side without having to worry about it. But spreads, what are we going to do about it?
Okay, so there's multiple questions in there. I think it's the first one I'll say is that the story of inflation in the euro area is slightly different to the one in the US. I think there is a delay in the inflation, both in the speed with which prices have gone up, but also the levels at which prices have gone up. And actually, when we talk about inflation in the euro area, we're really not really talking about one inflation rate. There's different stories in Europe, and there isn't just the one inflation rate. If you look at France, you have inflation of about 5% in annual terms. If you look at Latvia, Lithuania, you've got a 15% inflation rate. So, you know, euro area inflation rate really isn't telling us the whole story here. I think that's important to reflect on the fact Europe isn't just the one thing. And actually, the correlation between Russian dependency on oil and inflation rates today is enormous. You really see where the inflation rates are really accelerating. That's where the energy dependency is seeing. Now, in terms of what to do, though, because I mean the policy really is one for those participating in the euro area, and they have to do something about that. So they target the euro area numbers, and that's understandable, right? But they're smaller than the US. I think that's an important thing. And the drivers of inflation in the euro area have been, up till now, up to very recently, I should say, really energy. And there isn't very much the ECB can do about that. And that's why they've been holding back. However, now we are seeing what they famously call the second round effects, where everybody's trying to pass on the costs to the next step in the line. And that, of course, the central banks can do something about. It's inevitable that they will have to do so. When you see inflation going up, at the rates that it is today, irrespective where it's coming from, the ECB has to do something about it, and they will. Even though they will announce it 30 minutes late, they will do something about that. Now, that's not without problems in the euro area, as you said. As the interest rates go up, we're having a rather awkward situation where the rates at which countries can borrow will also increase. And what's interesting about that, they don't increase at the same speed. Those countries that tend to have poor fiscal positions will see their interest rates going up much faster than others that don't have quite so weak fiscal positions. And that's a problem. That means that those countries won't be able to borrow to finance their own expenditures quite at the same capacity as other countries are. And that's what we call financial fragmentation. This is a unique euro area problem. You don't see this anywhere else, and it has to do with the architecture. And the question is what to do about that. I'm sure that the ECB has worried about that a lot, because the last thing we want now is a financial crisis. We don't want to increase interest rates as a result of having to react to inflation and yet shut countries out from markets, from the ability to borrow. This is a real problem in Europe, and it has to do with the fact that we are an imperfect architecture. My sense is that the ECB is thinking, without having any inside information, I think the ECB is really thinking about how to tackle not only inflation to the extent that it can, but also deal with this financial fragmentation. And they will have to think of new tools that they will be able to use to try and tame the markets and actually convince them, listen, we are doing whatever we can to keep both inflation at levels which are manageable, but also allowing countries to have access to the markets.
Well, John, for this purpose, at least right here, you're the markets guy. And there's always stuff going up, stuff going down. I mean, if you look at some of the sort of long-term market-based inflation measures, like the five-year forwards, et cetera, they've actually been coming down in recent months. But if you were to point out some of the silver linings of all this disaster scenarios in the market, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I would remind all of you that the average bear market lasts 9.5 months. Okay, so if you have a long-term, think even 3 to 5 years financial plan, stick with it. Okay, and let the professionals sort of make the nuanced changes within that. But I think there's several. I'll point to 4 silver lining areas, and they're not just economic silver linings, but I think geopolitical silver linings. Okay, one, with regard to energy, the good news is, with all the bad news that we've heard, this dynamic is going to hasten the move towards renewables. But it will only work if government and the private sector both, well, if government helps to fund that move to the extent that it can, and creates a regulatory structure or incentives for the private sector to do it as well. For instance, in the United States, we have a $90 billion loan program out of the Department of Energy that's focused on, it's almost like venture loans instead of investments, because the government can't make equity investments, focused on green technology. So that's point number one. Point number 2 is feed the world. You know, we have a real challenge, we in the West, with the global South. I mean, the attitude of the global South, which largely many of those nations voted not to condemn this Russian aggression. We have a challenge because many countries in the global South, their view about, you know, the West or Russia is a pox on both of your houses. You guys promised us vaccines, you didn't get them to us. You've had a history of imperialism, grabbing all of our natural resources, etc. With Feed the World, we have an opportunity to combat Putin's effort to convince the nations in the global South that the food crisis is the fault of sanctions, as opposed to his weaponization of grains and fertilizer, by moving forward and investing in crops that are sustainable, that are pest resistant, that are drought resistant, that are higher yield, and sort of stepping in to fill that breach. So that's another area of opportunity we have. A third area is on trade. Now, the politics of trade in our country is fraught. We heard Will Hurd was talking about that last night at the you know, the midterm discussion about how tough that is. I see Jennifer Hillman sitting here. I know Karen Kornbluth, others who are here who have had a long history in dealing with this. I was working on TTIP extensively as ambassador to Germany. We're not going to get a big trade agreement, but there are some easy wins. If you look at the ability to coordinate and come to convergence on standards, if you look at some of the sanctions that were imposed during, or I'm sorry, tariffs that were imposed during the Trump years that can be taken off that really aren't that effective from a geopolitical standpoint, but that can help us economically. That's another area that is a potential silver lining for us. So I think and then fundamentally, you know, as things are I was just going to say one other area is as we rethink supply chains, think about in the United States, Latin America, think about in Europe, Africa, and the kinds of investments that can be made to train people and investments in production facilities in those places, those aren't going to help in the immediate short term, but I think they can kind of shape the global economy so that we come out of this with some real energy, so to speak, moving in the growth direction.
And then I guess I have one final sort of enigma that I would like you to also weigh in on, which is, yes, we've got war, we've got inflation that we haven't had for a long time, but the really big, for me at least, is China. Now, there's a lot of talk about systemic rivalry, and some might even argue that there are entities who likes that rivalry, etc. But the reality is, if you look at the Chinese economy, there are some real issues, right? I mean, do we actually, after what they have been doing on COVID, zero COVID, do we trust the Communist Party to do the rational thing on economics? We know what Chinese demographic looks like in the long run. And it has implications quite likely for the housing market, real estate sector in China. But what if we actually are looking at a world in which the potential growth rate in China might only be 2%? What does that look like? Where is growth in the long run then going to come from, given that Europe, the United States, everywhere else is also aging? You get the easy ones.
You get the easy ones, yeah. Look, I mean, I think that what you described is accurate. I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, first of all, let me just start by the controversial argument, which is it such a bad thing if we slow down a little bit? Think about the environment, the challenge of the environment. Now, I'm not part of the degrowth
Club
the club. No, I'm not part of it, simply because it doesn't sell. But in any case, it's impossible to imagine one generation from one generation to the next actually going backwards. It just can't do that. But it's undeniable that we've got to do better, and actually preserving the environment is going to push us in a direction of, you know, how do we save things? I mean, just these insatiable expansion. We will not be able to meet the environment targets, which are very ambitious in the EU by all stakeholders, and will require huge changes in our own lifestyle as well. We've got to do that for the environment. Now, on China, because I think that is an interesting question. Again, if I were to pick on differences between the way that the EU and the US sees China, I think the US is a lot more decided what it thinks about China. Whether we agree or don't agree, that's one thing. The EU doesn't really have a position on China. The systemic rivalry, you said, which is a buzzword, it's often used in this part of the town, but it is one that isn't necessarily shared by everybody, and it has actually implications which go beyond just the buzziness of the word. Now, my sense about China is the bottom line is that we cannot not engage with China. That's a fact. The US and the EU is about 800 billion people. China is 1.4. Well, just that, the scale of it implies that we cannot not engage with China. Now, how would you characterize what you call the West and China? I think there's a dividing line that is actually quite divisive. All dividing lines tend to be. But in my sense, I think it's important to try and find a model that works, at least as minimal engagement. The multilateral system is absolutely essential that we find a way to engage with China. The WTO, which is perhaps the biggest multilateral forum that we have in terms of engaging in trade, will have to be rewritten. And China, no doubt, is going to have to hold the pen a little bit because it is a big country and it contributes to it. Now, how do we do that? What is the common denominator on which we can all agree and actually continue open and trade that is welfare enhancing? I think that's really the big question to solve. And it's going to require, negotiations on both sides. It cannot be that China fits a rule book that is written by others for a very different system, whether we agree or not. If you believe that the bottom line is we have to engage with China, well, we have to find ways of doing that. And preserving the environment. It's interesting about, and I come back to the environment because, I agree with you, John, that this is an opportunity now. It accelerates the decoupling of fossil fuels, but we are very far from meeting our objectives, and China has even postponed its targets from 2050 to 2060, understandably, given that it's coming from a very low level. But in any case, China needs to be on board, or it's not happening.
You asked on China, you asked would they behave rationally in terms of how they handle the economy. And my answer to that is yes, they will behave rationally given their perspective on economic growth and what they need to do. And I think one of the things we need to understand is we've got to do a better job of putting ourselves in our adversaries' shoes as we think that through. I think a couple of questions with China. Number one, the administration, while clearly tough on China is one of the few things you can get bipartisan support on these days, tough on China, tough on Russia, and maybe a little bit of stuff on guns, thanks to Chris Murphy. But, you know, the reality is the administration shifted somewhat because it's not just tough on China. It's tough on China, but also, you know, it's competing with them where we need to, but cooperating and coordinating where we can, particularly on issues like climate change, like nuclear proliferation, and taking a hard look at some of the tariff and trade issues. I do think Europe needs to ask itself, though, and I flagged this earlier, does it make sense for, you know, two of the great companies in Germany, Mercedes and Volkswagen, to get 40% of their profits from China? I mean, the reality is right now China needs Europe. And China, particularly with the United States sort of moving away from China more, China needs Europe. It needs it from a commercial standpoint. It needs it from an economic standpoint. This actually, I think, complicates their relationship with Russia, at least during the Ukraine situation, because they don't want to get painted with a Putin pariah brush. But does Europe risk 5 years from now, 7 years from now, being so dependent on China economically that China will have its same grips on Europe that Russia does today from an energy standpoint? I think that's a major question that has to be addressed here.
Now, we have a little time. If there's somebody in the audience who have a question they would dying to ask, you may have to speak up quite a bit, although you can just give me the question and I will repeat.
I was wondering how the ever-growing crypto markets, cryptocurrencies, and DAOs fit in this picture. So, thank you.
They don't.
Not at all, really.
Well, no, I mean, okay, so it's a very important question. If I were to give a few messages, one is cryptocurrencies, in my view, will not replace the big currencies, the dollar, the euro. They are not the same thing. They're a private issued asset that goes up and it goes down. It goes very, I mean, that's, if you're interested, if you're a risk investor, please go ahead, invest in them. But if you are not a risk investor, stay away from them. But they will not be the means of exchange that we call currencies because they don't have the right properties to become currencies. So in my view, they're just another asset. They will be regulated. I'm convinced about that. Aspects of it will be regulated, primarily the exchanges, which is where they're being transacted. But other than that, it's up to your risk profile to go and invest in them. They will not be currencies, in my view.
I would say when you think of crypto, there are two ways to look at it. Number one, the underlying technology, the blockchain technology. That is important. That's significant. That is something worth investing in. Crypto, go to Vegas.
Next.
Thank you very much indeed. This is Pablo Zalba from Deloitte and from MEP. I would like to go back to the issue of financial fragmentation. Maria raised the issue about the new tools that ECB should arise at this respect, or to cope with financial fragmentation and spreads. And my question is, at what extent that new tool or those new tools should include conditionality or not?
Thank you, Pablo. Lovely to see you again. So I guess that question is at me.
Yes, that question is definitely for you.
Yeah, so look, we have a tool, it's called OMT, which exists, has never been used, but it's good to have because if we were to...
Before we get it, we have brief answers. So OMT and the whole roll-up might not be...
2 minutes.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
The new tools need to look like OMT. They will have to be looking at OMT, but they cannot have the same conditionality, or they won't be in real time. The instrument that we need right now is an instrument that can be decided at the same cycle as interest rates, so they need to be done every 2 weeks, in other words, and therefore cannot have the same degree of conditionality. Now, that is the $1 million question, how to solve that. I've written something on it. I ask you to read it and see what conditionality we have instead.
Succinct, perfect. Next question.
Thank you. Dania Khatib from Research Center for Cooperation and Peacebuilding, Beirut. I have more of a comment than a question. The Chinese look at themselves...
Make it a question.
Okay, so the Chinese look at themselves as the Middle Earth. So they look at themselves as the rightful hegemon in the South China Sea. So what's the plan for the West? I mean, they're not going to relinquish on their ambitions in the South China Sea. Thank you.
I think the plan is to make it clear that if they proceed in a way that is similar to what Russia has done, if they proceed in a way of aggression and a military attack, there will be a significant price for them to pay. And I would have to believe that as Xi Jinping is looking at the Western response, to the current situation, he's recognizing there will be a significant economic price to be paid. He probably also is saying, well, I guess they don't want to engage in a military conflict with a nuclear power, so he's maybe less afraid about that. But I would also think that he's looking at the impotence in many respects of the vaunted Russian military and saying, wow, are we even ready for this here in China? We haven't been in a shooting war since Vietnam in the late 1970s, and maybe that's giving him pause to think as well. So, I mean, what we need to do, and this is what gets back so important to Russia and sanctions and all that, and keeping them in force, we need to show that crime does not pay. And I think that's what we have to do about that.
I think we maybe have time for one very, very, very quick question.
Very quick. I'm Megan Richards. I'm a senior visiting fellow at GMF. You talked about the importance of energy prices, and Maria, you mentioned the importance of driving innovation with high energy prices. But the G7 has just called for a cap on oil prices. It's not really going to help in terms of improving innovation. We have to help the poor people. But can you give us an idea of how this is going to solve inflation and still generate innovation?
Can you do it in 30 seconds?
Theoretically can work very well. In practice, I don't think so. You can either have price controls or you can have quantity controls. Price controls are very difficult to enforce, in my view, particularly in areas that it matters. Well, how are you going to enforce a price cap on the oil price that the Indians pay? We cannot do that. I mean, and it would be very difficult also to enforce it domestically, because it could be somebody else can actually outprice us, as it were, and that's not going to work in my view. The only thing that works is quantities. Stop buying oil and gas from Russia.
Well, and you also heard the CEO from Exxon say yesterday that from a long-term standpoint, what they've got to do is develop sources of energy that work in a low-cost environment as well. So this is where the industry knows that it has to head as well.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank the audience, all of you, for paying attention, and my two wonderful panelists, Maria de Mertes and John B. Emerson. And then it is my pleasure to hand over to the next moderator, who is Martina Stevis-Gridnev, the Brussels bureau chief, and many, many other things that I don't unfortunately have time to go into for the New York Times here in Brussels. Martina.
Indoors on such a gorgeous day. My name is Martina Stevis-Gridnev. I'm the Brussels bureau chief for the New York Times, and I'm delighted to welcome an incredibly qualified panel this morning to talk about a truly pressing matter that has been really front of mind for policymakers and for people around the world at the back of the crisis in Ukraine, which is the question of food security. It's something that's been on the agenda for years because of climate change and now has become even more urgent and vital. I'm going to introduce my panel in 1 second once their seating is ready. And we also have a video address coming in. So just give us a couple of minutes to do that. Thank you. Wonderful. So it's a real honor and privilege to introduce the panel this morning. The Honorable Jim Costa, Congressman of California, Megan Green, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, Dr. Bernhard Lawrence, who's the founder of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress at Deloitte, and Ms. Eileen O'Connor, Senior Vice President for Strategic Communications and Policy at the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we get into our debate and discussion, I want to introduce the video address this morning by the Honorable Ricarda Lang, who's a member of the German Bundestag and the co-leader of Alliance 90 and the Greens. Thank you.
Good morning, Brussels Forum. My name is Suda David Wilf, and I'm here today with Ricarda Lang, co-chair of the German Green Party, Bündnis 90 Die Grünen. She's also a member of the German Bundestag. Ricarda, the war against Ukraine has really put a focus on food insecurity as well as energy independence from authoritarian actors. How can we remain on the path towards sustainability, especially considering, or can we just do that real quick again? I'm so sorry.
No
Wir machen das
problem.
nochmal, yeah?
The perils of life.
Okay.
Wait 1 second.
I'll just have a sip.
Yes,
while
please
waiting.
do.
All right, stay with us. Hopefully they'll come back shortly.
Sure. Okay, 5 seconds. 5.
Give me a minute to just consult with someone. Okay, well, that was a bit too much reality, perhaps, on how these wonderful glossy events are put together. In the interest of time and keeping your attention,
co-chair of the German
why
Green
don't I
Party
just...
and
Oh,
also
okay,
a member
here
of
we
the
go.
German Parliament.
Take 2.
Ricarda, Russia's war against Ukraine has really stressed the need for energy independence from authoritarian actors and also has put into focus the fragility of our supply chains. As energy costs are rising and food insecurity looms, how can we remain on the path toward sustainability and avoid backsliding? I mean, Minister Habeck just announced the need for the use of coal in the interim period.
First of all, thanks for having me, and also hello to Brussels. And I think what you just said is the main focus we are having as a government right now, and that's independence. Because we have seen that the dependency, especially on Russia, but the dependency on fossil fuels in total, has made us vulnerable, has made us less strong, less capable in counteracting this Russian war. And therefore, we need to get independent of Russia, but also of fossil fuels altogether, because they always hold like a pull towards monopoles. And those monopoles are political and economic. And therefore, the only energy sources that belong to no one, because they belong to all of us, are sun and are wind. So renewable energies are a way not only of protecting our climate, but also of making us independent of authoritarian states. And therefore, they're a way of also defending our democracy. And I think this is a chance we have at the moment. On the one hand, on a short-term scale, we need to take steps that are not what I thought we would do when we as a Green Party entered government. Using coal more again, building LNG terminals. But on a longer scale, everybody is understanding now that sustainability, climate protection and renewable energies are a question of national and European security. And this is the spirit we need right now.
But do you think in this backdrop of multiple crises, I mean, we're still in this pandemic and now Russia's aggression, that momentum for climate protection has been lost?
This could happen if we are not careful, because I think it's something we are often trained upon and how politics often work, because we are elected for periods of 4 years. So there's always like this short-term tendency. And there's always this feeling of, well, you need to tackle the crisis that is happening right now. And I do understand it. I feel it with myself. Right now, the war in Ukraine is everywhere. Right now, the inflation is everywhere. But on the one hand, you need to understand the links between these crises, because the inflation has something to do with fossil fuels. It's a fossil inflation. And the war in Ukraine has something to do on dependency on supply chains on Russia. And so what we need to do is learn from this crisis and do it better in the future, especially regarding China, and therefore sustainability, getting to know and also acting on the fact that the markets of the future will be climate neutral and digital. This will also be things that will prevent situations from this, from happening again. And I think only a society that prepares for the challenges, that are not on the forefront, that are for the future, that go a little bit more that are not as loud at the moment, only a society that prepares for these challenges will be able to act on new challenges in the future. So I'm convinced only a society that finds a way of tackling the climate crisis, of tackling the 1.5 degree goal, only this society will be able to act on something like the Ukraine war happening in the future.
Thank you, Ricarda. That was Ricarda Lang of Bündnis 90 Die Grünen. And now back to you, Brussels Forum.
All right. Thanks so much for bearing with us through that little glitch. So Obviously, we all understand what we're here this morning to talk about. The invasion of Ukraine has created a sort of unexpected massive crisis that is just clearly coming to the fore now, and it's a very time-sensitive crisis. As many of you will have read in the news and will have heard, there's 22 million tons of grains, vital grains that are necessary for the world food markets, and in particular desperately needed in areas that are chronically food insecure, and those are stuck mostly at the port of Odessa. The international community is rallying to release those grains safely, put them onto the world, and avert hunger. People like the World Food Program Director David Beasley have spoken with such urgency about this, and it's now clear that these are not words, and we are running out of time. You perhaps are aware that apart from the urgency of getting these foods to market and to places that really need them, there is an overwhelming need to save the next harvest, the summer harvest of grains in Ukraine, which should be happening in the course of the summer. If there's nowhere to store these grains, they'll be lost, and so that crisis will be compounded over the next several months. We dare not really think of the scale of consequences should this happen. And so obviously, there's a climate component, but there's obviously a component that has to do with international diplomacy and the war in Ukraine. What I'll do is I'd love to get some first thoughts from the panelists. Then hopefully we'll be able to have a debate and a more dynamic discussion, and then I'll bring you all in here since you've been so good to show up this morning for us. Congressman Costa, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the German Marshall Fund for putting on this Brussels Forum. It's, I think, important for a whole host of reasons, and the topic matters that we're discussing. With the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan and 50 years of the GMF, it's good to have this effort that is critical, I think, toward the directions that we and the challenges that we are facing and how we reach the goals that we all, I think, concur on are necessary. I know you have a lot of kind of, as some of my colleagues in Washington refer to, confused and amused about what goes on in California. As a California representative, I have a different take than most people you probably run into. I'm a farmer, and California is the largest agricultural state in the nation, 5th largest economy in the world. We produce half the nation's fruits and vegetables in California. We're 20% of the milk production in California, 70% of the world's almonds, 50% of the world's pistachios. The list goes on and on and on, over 300 commodities. Food is a national security issue. It's not often looked at that, but it's a world security issue. And I would tell you that even if this horrific invasion by President Putin and Russia to Ukraine had not taken place, the issue of food and its availability in the long term is something that we have to deal with. Had 200 years ago 1.7 billion people on the planet. 200 years later, now we have 7 billion people on the planet. By the middle of the century, it's estimated we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet. And we say in California, where water flows, food grows. A direct connection, as John Emerson will tell you. And we've been fighting over our water resources in California for over 100 years. But I believe in the next 10 to 15 years, with climate change, that water as a resource will rival energy as to whether or not nation states can live together amicably. And therefore, while we're talking about Ukraine today and the 22 million tons of wheat that is being held up and the impact it will have, in which Russia and Ukraine produce about a third of the protein of wheat for the entire world, and the potential, as Sandra Powers has indicated, potentially 49 million people being impacted by famine if we don't find a short-term solution. Today's panel, I hope, will focus both on the short-term challenges that we're facing with regards to the situation because of this horrific war in Ukraine with Russia and food security, but also as it relates to the long-term challenges that we're facing, as it relates to climate change and the impact to produce food, protein, for 9 billion people on this planet by the middle of the century. Therein lies the challenge, and it all evolves around sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Megan Green, Harvard, tell us, as an economist, this must be quite an immediately pressing problem for the world economy.
Yeah, so I'm really glad the Brussels Forum has decided to highlight this in a panel. There has been so much ink spilled on the energy crisis we're all facing, but relatively little over the food crisis, and it will end up affecting far more people and will probably be longer lasting. And I would also highlight that we were in a food security crisis before Russia invaded Ukraine. Now it's obviously much worse. Russia and Ukraine account for 10% of the calories globally traded. About 26 countries rely on Russia and or Ukraine for more than half of their grains. And I want to also set the scene for this. The US is hiking interest rates aggressively. The US dollar is appreciating. Emerging markets had over-leveraged before the pandemic. They then had to borrow more to pay for their pandemic response. Now they're trying to retrench as they're facing much higher costs. A lot of them are providing subsidies for food. That's getting much more expensive. And so it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these emerging markets to continue with these subsidies, let alone increase them. So I do think that the IMF is going to be pretty busy over the next couple of years. I think we will have an emerging market and frontier market crisis coming down the pike. And that's the backdrop for a food insecurity crisis, which doesn't really bode well. I would also say that, on average, the lower income households spend more than half of their income on food. So there are real distribution consequences of the food security crisis, both in emerging markets and developed economies, actually. So this overlaps with the inequality crisis that we're also facing. And so this really needs to be taken seriously. What can we do about it? That's a harder question. First of all, in this world where protectionism seems to be acceptable now, industrial policy is embraced by all countries on both sides of the political spectrum. It's no wonder that export controls are the first measure that countries are imposing, India, Indonesia, China, on fertilizer. That's a problem. We call those deadweight losses in economics when you impose export controls and introduce rigidities into markets. That's just going to make things more expensive. So we need the biggest exporters of food to agree that they're going to announce to not have export controls. I think that's really important. And then the way in which we do food aid, I think, might need to change. The US is the biggest provider of food aid. And we provide it in the form of actual food, American-grown food. More than half of it has to be sent on American ships. We just passed a bill whereby we're sending, I think it's $290 million worth of food. We're paying about $390 million just to send it. So that's not particularly efficient. We need to figure out how to send cash and expertise rather than providing food and all the shipping costs. And so that could go a long way towards alleviating the food crisis as well. I'll finish there.
Thanks, Megan. And Bernhard, I know that you look at the question of sustainability. Obviously, this crisis in this moment is so important in focusing minds. Can you talk a little bit about the medium-term goal of sustainability before we go back into talking about the immediate crisis at hand?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like also to emphasize how important it is that German Marshallfund does this panel as part of their effort to talk about strategic future. Because as Aline just pointed out, I think it's not only about energy crisis, it's a new form of challenge that we are facing here. And they are really strongly interconnected, and one can argue that they are really interconnected. I will make maybe 2 or 3 comments to set the scene a little bit, also from a strategic perspective globally, with regard to what you just referred to, the sustainability discourse. But first, I think one has to mention that this is not happening without a plan. I mean, the Russians know exactly what they do, and I think it's a new form of hybrid warfare that we see here with another hybrid form. I mean, the German Vice-Chancellor the other week in Berlin addressed the German business community, addressing and saying that gas is weaponized now. And I think we can see, as David Seeley, you referred to, the World Food Programme's director, is saying that there is now a weapon and that the declaration of war to food security globally. And I think one has to understand that this is part of the plan, and this is part of something that we have to tackle with our own plan as I think, a group of nations that are working together on this, sitting today together in Elmore exactly discussing this. That's my first point, that this is a form of hybrid warfare. Secondly, of course, one has to understand that this comes to a crisis, and the congressman just referred to it, and Eileen also, that is already there, and that's due to climate change. I think if we look at countries like Somalia, they have the 4th year with the low rain seasons, and now hitting this, 90% of their grains come from Ukraine. They're really confronted with the unheard presidency of crisis management, and that leads me to my second point. We have to see this as an interconnected problem of climate security, climate crisis, and now this, I think, this new challenge as a hybrid war, and we have to tackle it in the long-term answer. And that leads me finally to my third point, and I just said that in Germany, in Elmau, the G7 is addressing this, and we expect them coming out this afternoon with their declaration, and I know it was on the Sherpa's agenda to come up with some ideas about how to both transfer money into the World Food Programme ideas, other UN agencies, but also addressing the longer-term perspective. And that's something that we should discuss here as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bennett. Eileen, I know that you've spent part of your career in countries that are potentially impacted immediately by this crisis. And I know that you also look at the question of communications and politics. And it seems that these are two things very front of mind right now. We see an information war going on around the question of the food crisis between Russia and in particular the European Union. And we're also seeing countries that are directly impacted as saying, well, we don't particularly care who's to blame. We just want solutions right now. Can you speak a little bit to those international political dynamics?
Well, I think those international political dynamics make this much, much harder because, yes, we've weaponized food. But I would also argue that this food crisis did not just start now. It started because of climate change. And obviously, the Russia knew what they were doing and has now weaponized that. But it also started because we have a food system that's broken. And it's been broken for a while. It's also due to too much concentration in bread baskets like Ukraine and, with all due respect to the congressman, like California. And so for us at the Rockefeller Foundation, we're spending $105 million in the next 3 years to do what the people who were the architects of the Marshall Plan did, and invest in long-term self-sufficiency and economic growth, as well as adaptable agricultural techniques that the countries in Africa can utilize. We've talked about a lot of the negative statistics here today, and they are. Every single minute we've been talking, there is another child that is dropped into severe food insecurity and malnutrition. And that's a crime, actually. And so what we need to do is to understand that there is a positive statistic out there. 60% of the undeveloped arable land, farmable land, is in Africa. We need to farm that land. We need to get agricultural technology that is available and can be used even in drought areas. And we need to get it to farmers, to every farmer, and make it accessible and affordable. So for us, the reason that we feel that there should be a warp speed for agricultural technology that's accessible and affordable. And to your point and your question, this is a communications issue. And to your point, protectionism has also led all of these countries in the world to sit on the fence and to be agreeable to some of the messages that Vladimir Putin is putting out. That this is the fault of the United States. This is the fault of Western European economies that didn't give enough aid, didn't live up to promises made about agricultural investment. And so we need to change this, and we need to think like the founders of the Marshall Plan and look at, instead of short-term growth and return our investment, return on the interest of loans, as you talked about, which is creating this debt problem. We need to think through about more grants, not loans. We need to think through about long-term, lower interest loans for things that are public, global public goods, like climate investment and like food and agricultural technology. So it is a communications problem, and we can fix it if we now invest in low and middle income countries in ways that enable them to have long-term sustainable growth and self-sufficiency, because the climate crisis is going to get worse. And so the only way that we can actually solve both, the food crisis and the climate crisis, is by agricultural technology that actually, and regenerative agriculture that actually can reduce emissions.
All right, thanks, Eileen. If that's okay with you, let's try and address this topic that we've just seen spans from the question of what happens over the next 4 weeks to what happens over the next 4 decades, starting with the immediate question, the immediate problem. To any of our panelists, how do you think the international community can credibly mediate the current crisis at hand to get grains out of Ukraine, out to the world, and just deal with that immediate and clearly extremely time-sensitive task? And do you have any insights in what the implications of such an operation might be? Might it strengthen Russia? Might it strengthen other countries, such as Turkey, that seems to be playing a role of mediation? This is a foreign policy and foreign international power question that is being played out. And could it potentially, if handled well, impact the chances of a slow stop to the fighting and create a first level of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia? Anyone?
Well, I think that there's an opportunity here to deal with the short-term problems of the 22 million metric tons of grain that's in Ukraine. We're looking at multiple solutions. There's the expansion of the rail transportation and the creation of silos in Poland and elsewhere to ensure that we don't know how much seed the Ukrainian farmer is going to be able to get in to possibly be harvested this year. But certainly there's, I think, a critical need that, and then Admiral Sarvidas has talked about demining portions of the Odessa harbor and to bring ships in and use part of a precedent during the Gulf War.
Which requires a lot of trust.
Right, it does. But to have neutral flag carriers move that grain out to where it's needed. And this is a short-term crisis that's got to be dealt with in the next couple months, if not sooner.
Absolutely. And let me just ask this question. Is this crisis right now, is this going to improve the situation even on a kind of macroeconomic level for the world and for the countries affected in sort of quite immediately? Will it provide an immediate relief, or are we just looking at, maybe a month or two of this bottleneck and then we're back to quite heightened crisis? Megan?
Yeah, so I think it'll be fairly short term. Actually, if you look at the Bloomberg spot sub-index for agriculture, it's actually come down quite a lot. Energy prices have come down quite a lot. It's summer. That's largely why. So there might be some reprieve in the very short term anyhow, just because prices have started to decelerate. I should highlight from really high levels though, right? So, and they're still increasing, just more slowly. So according to the FAO food price index, food prices are up 23% year on year in May. That's a big deceleration from March. 23%. The World Bank says that 10 million people are pushed into extreme poverty for every percentage point increase. So it's still quite dire, but it's a little bit of reprieve. And that's without opening up the ports. I do think that opening up the ports could help a lot. It doesn't address the fertilizer issue, though, which is I mean, Russia's the world's largest exporter of fertilizer. And so we do need to address that as well, because right now you have all kinds of harvests being planted with a quarter of the fertilizer. So, of course, yields will be smaller down the line, and so this will perpetuate for a while if we don't also crack that nut. I'd also point out that China has imposed an export ban on fertilizers. So if China were to revoke that, that might help a little bit in trying to fill in some of the supply gaps.
Right, Eileen?
Yeah, I would actually disagree. So our intelligence, we have a dashboard that we've just launched with Grow Intelligence, and our forward predictive models show that actually because of the fertilizer issue and because of the fact that China has not been planting in the way that it would have because of COVID, and so similarly in other countries, that this food crisis is going to go on not just in the short term, but for years. In addition, we still have a lot of climate disruption that is going on, drought and flooding and other things. And then you have, just migration from the Ukraine So there's less being planted. But also, I would also say that, I spent over 4 decades in and out of Russia as a journalist and as an attorney. And I've talked to Vladimir Putin many, many times. He is not interested in a peace solution. He's interested in bringing the West to its knees. And he is not interested in trying to open up those ports. In fact, there's evidence that he's been actually destroying grain silos in Ukraine. So it's not just about getting it out, it's getting it out in time before he destroys it. So the problem that we have is that he believes that the Russian people, and I think this too, if you look at history in Russia, that they can in fact suffer far more and will be willing to do so than people in Europe and in other countries who are going to be facing heating oil shortages and high inflation and other things. We're already seeing protests in places like Britain about the cost of living. So I think that's a big problem for us, is that I think we're hopeful for a diplomatic solution. Of course we all are. But I don't know that that's going to come anytime soon.
Yeah. For the record, we don't disagree. I was also saying there might be short-term reprieve, but this is a problem for a while. Yeah.
I think it was only an amendment.
I misunderstood.
I have never spoken to Vladimir Putin, I'm afraid, but my reading of them at the moment is that we are in a dilemma as a Western societies, because they will ask us to pay a price for opening the harbors, and I don't see that we are willing to pay this price. It's pretty obvious what they want us to do with regard to our sanctions and the regime, and that's why in the short term I don't see this happen. And without a deal with Russia, I don't see that there will be any chance to get into the harbors or outside it. So we need midterm and long-term strategies globally to deal with it. And that goes back to your first point, Megan, that it will be costly. We will have to invest. We have to find solutions that are living with this, as this will, and this is a talk on this conference, that this crisis will go on for 1 or 2 or 3 years, at least. And that's something where I expect something maybe coming out of Elmo today, and something that will be dealt with in the international community, I think, over the next 6 months.
Well, we have to work on mutual tracks, obviously. I say food is a national security issue, but I mean, not only in the United States, but in Europe. But people don't think of that because there's a disconnect, because they think that, I go to my favorite restaurants, I go to, to the market, or there's so much food, what do you mean? And what they don't realize is that for about 1 billion people, we have been able to figure out a way to make it sustainable. But we've got 7 billion people on the planet. And this is a ticking time bomb, in my view, in terms of the need to feed the world. And frankly, we don't have a plan. I mean, we ought to, as Western democracies, to your point, have our own Belt and Road policy in Africa that would, Reagan has said, instead of giving a person a fish, why don't you teach them how to fish? And clearly, there's a lot of ag technology that we could do. But I was talking to Secretary Vilsack about this problem of we export our food, but the cost of getting the food there is higher than the value of the food. And that doesn't get to the point where you get to a port in Africa and then trying to get that food inland, which goes to even greater costs. We've got to figure this out, and we've got to work on both tracks.
I mean, thanks for that fantastic opportunity to move on to the question of inequality. And the answer to the question is because someone in the developed world is profiting of that fish that's sold and the transport of that fish to Africa, et cetera. So the incentive structure has just been completely out of whack for so many years. There is, I think Megan spoke about it the most and in depth, about how the question of getting food aid to the developing world has been long subject to what we would call colloquially tied aid, subsidies, and frankly, people and industries in the United States and in Europe do profit from this business. This is, I've covered Somalia. I've actually watched WFP grain get transported to the port of Berbera with my own eyes, and you can see the inefficiencies there, and that yet year in and year out, you come up against the same problems. Which brings me to the question of inequality that I think is really important that Megan raised, and has to do with this critical moment, constantly deteriorating view of Western liberal democracy in the eyes of the developing world. I think this is a really serious issue that's being brought to the fore with this particular crisis. There is clearly agency in the Western world for the food crisis right now in the developing world. Whether this, of course, the war in Russia, the Russian invasion is causing the current problem, but this has been years in the making, decades in the making by Western liberal actors. And I'm really curious as to what you think is the way to preserve diplomatic capital, to preserve goodwill, and to be able to credibly support the developing world in this immediate crisis in the next few years, not only because it's a humanitarian imperative to save lives, but also it is becoming ever clearer that without having those allies on board, you can't really impact change in the world, and in particular with regards to aggressors. Anyone interested?
You want to start?
Sorry, that was a very long question.
I guess I can start. I mean, in the sense of, I do think that the concept of liberal democracies, because of divisions within our own countries, people are questioning our systems, and I think our systems have been. Where there's a lot of misinformation, obviously, by Vladimir Putin, but also within our own countries. And I've covered many wars, and I've been sort of really watching this so carefully. And the one thing I've always found that started conflict is the media, and I would say sometimes politicians and others who are trying to gain power by pitting people against each other. And that, to me, through misinformation and disinformation, and that, to me, is what I've seen happening in the United States, and I'm really, really sad about it. And I'm also really scared about it. And I think that we have to really think about that, and I think that we have to rely, Representative Costa is not like that, but I think that we have to, really start talking to each other as nations who believe in freedom and democracy, and who show the world and those in these countries that this is something that we support and believe in, but that we also will support them and not just support our own self-interest, because I think they see us as being more interested in our own economic interests than in global growth and sustainable growth. And I think, again, that's the difference between the architects of the Marshall Plan and where we are today with the Bretton Woods system and with the way that we deal with public development finance. It's too expensive for many of these countries, and it's not long-term enough. And I think that's got to change. And that would help reframe what liberal democracies stand for. Sorry.
Anyone else before we take questions from our audience?
I mean, I agree completely. I mean, we have both inequality in our countries, as we call the donor community, with respect to the global south, but we have, of course, you addressing the question of just transition. I mean, it's the question of globally looking into climate change as a global problem, and the global south expecting us to take our responsibility and leadership role here. And that is something we discussed earlier in the preparation meeting, where we really have to be aware that there's a certain expectation. There were promises over the last 20 years, the 100 billion pledge, now another pledge at COP26. And I think we have to recognize at some point that we have to deliver and support the global south in this transition to become a just transition, right?
Yeah, I'll say something really obvious, which is money would help, right? So if we could mobilize capital, and not just public capital, if we could mobilize private capital, that could be a game changer. The ESG movement is trying to mobilize private capital, but there's a huge focus on the E piece, and it's the environmental piece, which is linked to the food insecurity crisis, but there's no mechanism to mobilize private capital for this specifically. So some sort of expansion of ESG principles to include this crisis, I think, would be useful.
But in part, there's a political crisis that you talked about in terms of in the U.S., in terms of our institutions. But I chair a subcommittee that deals with foreign agriculture. We're reauthorizing the Farm Bill next year. But whether it's the Farm and Fork strategy here in Europe, or whether it's the reauthorization of the Farm Bill next year in America, there's a disconnect between where that policy, whether it be in Europe or in the United States, plays in terms of a global response to the need of hunger that is only going to grow with population and the climate change issues we're having to deal with. And so I mean, we saw during the pandemic food shortages for short periods of time because of supply chain issues. We still have those supply chain issues that we're dealing with, not only in our country, but exporting food around the world. We've got, in the last 4 months, 80% of the shipping containers coming into California all floating and going back empty. It's so profitable for them to, you know, and 44% of our agriculture is exported, so it's really depressed prices. There's no really policy that looks at this in the totality and combines our efforts with Europe and the United States, which is really what a billion people must do if we want to get the support in Africa, support in South America and other places for this pressing crisis with Ukraine. We're having difficulty getting support in Africa and South America among those countries on what is a whole issue that could destabilize democracies in the world.
Thank you so much. So it looks like we might have time for 3 questions. Let me start here. Yes, thanks. Try, just introduce yourself. Keep it as short as possible,
Okay,
please.
thank you. My name is Rana Gürden, MMF Fellow and the Head of Corporate Communication of a company based in Turkey, Istanbul. Thank you very much for this eye-opening session and talking about the inequality and many comments. But I would like to emphasize on food waste. Because it is, I mean, according to the World Food Programme, 1/3 of products produced for human consumption is lost and wasted globally. And this is amount to 1.3 billion tons per year and worth approximately $1 trillion per year. And if wasted food were a country, it will be the 3rd largest producer of carbon dioxide in the world after US and China. And as you mentioned, consumers in rich countries waste almost as much food as the entire net food production sub-Saharan Africa. So in order to discuss the future and food security, which I agree that it's the national security concern, how come that we couldn't prevent this food waste in a more political way and on policy basis?
It's a real problem, and we're trying to address this in the next year's Farm Bill. But the amount of food that we waste in the United States is really clearly inexcusable.
Thank you. Go on.
Hi, Aristolopoulos from Johns Hopkins University SAIS. Speaking of solutions, medium long-term solutions, a huge amount of arable land is used for livestock, and we haven't really talked about meat and the role of meat in this discussion. How would you assess a possible transatlantic meat consumption cap and trade system inspired by the carbon ETS to disincentivize consumption of meat and incentivize consumption of legumes, for example, higher protein intensity foods, and investment in those kind of higher protein intensity foods in the development world to change the paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you.
We won't even do it for carbon in the U.S. So I can't imagine.
How can we do that?
Yeah, sorry. Parts of the U.S. do, but in aggregate, so I can't imagine it happening for red meat in particular. It's an interesting idea. I actually just attended a food insecurity panel at Chatham House, and the entire panel was about kind of veganism and switching your demand. And we're not really looking at the demand side of things with this crisis, so it's useful that you pointed out.
So can I just, 2 things. One, I think that we, from the communications point of view, that we make a mistake by talking about no meat. I think that there are ways that meat can be grown that is actually a regenerative agricultural plus and can improve land. Secondly, the carbon credit that Megan is talking about, these problems with carbon credits, are something that we're very focused on, and the German government is very focused on, and others. And the problem right now, and we're going to try to work this summer, even before COP, to fix this issue, carbon credits are only given for things like trees that absorb carbon right now, not for prospective reductions, which is what you're talking about, future reductions. We could actually unleash almost $1 trillion of private capital in concessionary capital to country energy transitions in South Africa, Indonesia, and India if we could, under COP 6.2, agree that carbon credits can be given to companies, banks, et cetera, for future carbon reductions. If we can technologically prove that decommissioning a coal plant and bringing in renewable energy will reduce carbon emissions by X and give a credit to a bank or something like that, we could unlock that capital right now. So I think that's what we're going to try to call on the countries that are part of the Paris Accord to do. And there's a lot of private capital that talks about being out there, but it's not in these projects.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to try and get 2 more questions. Go, and then the young man here.
Heinrich Kreft, I'm a German diplomat, but currently professor at Andras University in Budapest. 2014, 2015, the big refugee crisis in Europe got started because the World Food Programme had to reduce portions to refugees in Syria and in Lebanon.
Well, someone would argue Assad caused that one,
Well,
but yeah, go on.
Well, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, the countries most dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain. So we are back in the same situation. The World Food Programme had to reduce portions in May. So we are in the same situation, so we have to act now. But my question is, do we have to take fertilizer off the sanctions list?
Okay.
Belarus is one of the biggest...
Well, short term, I think we have to consider that. I mean, one of the high input costs that we have among our farmers in the U.S. is fertilizer that's doubled and tripled in costs. And but I think we got to make distinctions between short-term and long-term strategies, and we're looking at new markets for that. But talk about renewable and climate change. Yeah. California, we set a goal by 2020 that 20% of our energy would be renewable in the state. Well, we exceeded that goal. It's 33% of California's energy use is renewable, and the goal by 2030 is to have it over 50%. If every state in the union had 50% or 34% of their energy renewable, we'd be in a much different place. And to tie it together with agriculture, I told you we produce 20% of the milk products in the country. We have 1,200 dairies. They're large dairies. But we have 119 dairy digesters that are converting that methane into energy. And when you look into the footprint of the ability to reduce the CO2 efforts and then take that use of methane and convert that to energy, you're now creating a circular pattern that also deals with a food product, but at the same time deals with the climate change and energy needs.
All right, let's try and squeeze in one last one, please.
I'm Cameron Lewis from Georgia Tech. So I have 2 questions. The Transatlantic community, there's desperately a need for diversification with the Global South. So how can the Transatlantic community go about that? And do you see that diversification be a turnaround for the Global South, or for a positive or for a negative? Thank you.
In 26 seconds?
23, go.
Yes, yes, and yes.
All right, well, maybe I can squeeze in one last one. No? Go for it, okay, come.
Well, I can shout.
Please do, project.
Okay, so my daughters, I come from Romania, we have a lot of snow in Bucharest. And my daughters really believe that snow is only in the mountains, because they don't see snow anymore. Thank you. So snow, no snow. The question is, how do we keep the global, the national public support for climate investments whilst having war, energy crisis, etc., in not just in the US but in Europe as well? Because
the 10 seconds answer is, while we have to communicate and explain people the connections of that, and that's something that is not easy, but something that we can do and that we have to really do it, and that's really what leadership is about at the moment.
All right, thanks so much. Thank you for your participation. Thanks so much to our panelists. Round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, welcome back from your coffee break. I am delighted to be able to both formally introduce and welcome our U.S. Congressional delegation here at Brussels Forum. I'm about to introduce and welcome U.S. Senator James Risch to the floor, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who will be with us here in a great conversation. We'll also have Senator Chris Murphy, who's going to join us fairly shortly as a key member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then from the House of Representatives, sitting in a row, so perfectly ready to be introduced. You've already heard from wonderful Congressman Jim Costa. We have Congressman Ted Deutsch and Congressman Steve Cohen. Thank you all so much for your contributions. Your experience in foreign policy and security policy could not be more important at this critical time. So please join me in thanking our wonderful U.S. Congressional delegation for being here. Thank you. All right, let's get this started. I am delighted to be able to introduce two extraordinary colleagues who are going to help us think through that bridging mechanism between the transatlantic and the Transpacific. Let me first begin to introduce the Honorable David McAllister. Mr. McAllister is chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament, also the vice president of, yes please, of the European People's Party, a distinguished German politician. But my favorite title, you're a Marshall Memorial Fellow, so you're part of the GMF family. So thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm so delighted to welcome Senator James Risch with us, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Risch is on several important committees to include the Select Committee on Intelligence. He's also a great friend of the German Marshall Fund. And I want to highlight a report that under Senator Risch's leadership, he produced in November of 2020. And I think we were a little busy over November of 2020. And I think it got a little overshadowed, wrote a phenomenal report that I commend to everyone here, a concrete agenda for transatlantic cooperation on China. It's an incredible roadmap, and those ideas, those said in 2020, still remain very relevant for today. So with that, I always like to say, let's start with the news of the day, and then let's get into the conversation. And obviously, the devastating news yesterday of a Russian missile attack against a shopping mall. I believe the 18 killed, 59 wounded. We need to get your reaction, because I think it's important at critical moments. Leadership is required. Would love your reactions. And Senator Risch, you just came from Kyiv. You've visited there in part when rockets were flying into Kyiv. You met with President Zelensky. I'd just like us to capture this moment, and then let's talk about China. So if I may start with you, Senator, and then Mr. McAllister, to you.
Well, you know what's happening there instantly when they start dropping rockets on shopping centers full of civilians. There's no word for it. I mean, we're beyond outrage. Right. I don't know what to call it. Certainly, it's a war crime. Certainly, people should be held accountable for that. But it's absolutely outrageous. It's hard to believe that we're living in the 21st century with the world order such as it is, that it can't be stopped. And I think that as we go forward, that's got to be part of the conversation. When I've said over and over again, when this is over, it's not over. We've now experienced the situation in Syria. Assad, who did just atrocious things, still sits in power in Syria. And here we move into this situation now in Ukraine, and Putin doing what he's doing. There's got to be a way of dealing with this. Obviously, a criminal court was put in place a long time ago, but when you can't get your hands on people, you can't get them, you can't hold them accountable. So I don't know how we do that, but as I say, it's there's no word really to describe this beyond outrageous.
Mr. McAllister, what do we do? The Ukrainian government has said, let's call this a state sponsor of terrorism. Russia's a state sponsor of terrorism. How do we make this stop? How do we prevent this from happening again?
First of all, I would like to underline what Jim Risch just said, and the G7 leaders were also very united in their reaction. This is another outrageous atrocity. And it just shows how, in what kind of barbaric way the Russian Federation is fighting this war against Ukraine, and especially against civilians, against women and children. This war in the middle of Europe is not only a war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. It's not only the largest country in Europe invading the second largest country. There's much more to it. This is the worst, the most fundamental attack on the European peace and security architecture since 1945. And we have to be very clear, if the Russian Federation succeeds in this war of aggression, they will go next steps. We have to listen very carefully to what President Putin has been saying and what he has been writing over the last few years. And obviously there's this bizarre idea in the Kremlin that you can divide the world, and especially Europe, into spheres of influence, like in the 19th century. And obviously the Russian dictator believes that everything that used to be part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union is Russia's. So Russia can exercise influence. And here we have to stop Putin. And that's why these brave men and women in Ukraine are not only defending their own country, they're defending our European, our Western values. And that's why they deserve all the support we can give them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Well, our conversation is to talk about bridging the transatlantic issues and challenges and work and the Transpacific. So I want to talk about, I want to ask you the dilemma that I have in Washington when we talk about great power competition. So in Washington, as I'm reading the unclassified overview of the U.S. National Defense Strategy, it says China is the pacing challenge, the most significant challenge, and Russia is a second challenge. We have to keep our eyes on that long-term challenge. Yet yesterday, Congressman Costa, I believe, absolutely rightly said that this war is the greatest challenge of our time. Yet, Senator Risch, in the letter that you put over this important report that you've and your staff worked on a transatlantic roadmap for China, you said, we must be prepared to work with our trusted allies and partners to counter an increasingly confrontational China that attempts to undermine prosperity, security, and good governance in every region of the globe. I consider this foreign policy issue to be the most important of our time. We have two crises that are the most important of our time. Do we have to prioritize one over the other, or can we do both? Senator Risch.
Well, in my defense, when I wrote that...
I did not mean to put words in, but it was powerful. It was powerful.
I still stand by that statement. But having said that, you know, we all made a big mistake when the Iron Curtain came down. We all thought, well, Russia now is going to take a deep breath and join the international community and do things the way civilized people do things. And, you know, they did some bad things over the time. There's no question about it. They poison people once in a while. They interfere with elections. They do cyber things. Those are all bad things, but yeah, other countries do some of that too. Who'd have guessed that they were going to start a medieval war in the 21st century? When I wrote that, that was way beyond any thought that I had. I think beyond the thought that the world had. I mean, what they're doing there is just absolutely atrocious, and it certainly diverts our focus from the China issue. As I was preparing for this, as you mentioned, I just came off of Ukraine. Of course, when I left Washington, D.C., we've got a number of domestic issues back there that are biting us. So it's hard to focus on China, and China's a long way away. But you have to take a deep breath and realize, look at what China has done over the last few years, the last 10 years, the last 3 decades. Look what they've done, and then realize that this is an existential challenge for us. It's a challenge to the world, to the world order. They are a competitor, mostly, I think, culturally, but also economically and militarily. But again, most people don't have a clue, unless you work in this space, of how they infiltrate all aspects of societies in all parts of the world. Vicki and I were, by the way, say hello to Idaho's former First Lady. Vicki, where are you?
Where's Mrs. Risch? Where are you? There she is. Thank you.
We were in Africa a couple of years ago, and this is something that I was astounded at. When you fly intra-Africa on an airline, you look around, there are more Chinese people on the airline than there are African people. And so all of a sudden, it brings home to you the effort that they're putting forth everywhere.
Absolutely. Mr. McAllister, can we do both? Can both Russia and China be the challenges of our times, or do we just have to prioritize? And for Europe, I keep hearing this, and Belgian Prime Minister De Croo yesterday, and I think he was sharing the sentiment I think I've heard expressed across Europe that, China's too important of an economic market for us. We cannot treat China like Russia, but yet we see China's growing intimidation. It's challenging of international maritime law in the South China Sea, human rights issues. That's very much been a discussion of the German government. Recently, the European Parliament is a very strong voice there. Can we send strong messages to both, or is it a China first, or is it a Russia first? What's your thoughts on that?
We have to do both, and we can do both.
Yes.
Short and midterm, of course, the question is how to deal with the Russian Federation. Russia is our immediate neighbor, and there will be a time after this war. And the big question will be, how can we as civilized democracies in Europe deal with a neighbor as long as Mr. Putin is in power? Russia is a bully. Russia is an aggressive bully. Russia is a very dangerous bully. And we have seen, not only since the 24th of February, but for the last 15, 20 years, how Russia step by step has tried to destabilize Europe and our immediate neighborhood. The Russian invasion in Georgia, 2008, the activities in Moldova, Transnistria, the Russian atrocities committed in Syria, the Russian activities in Libya or in other countries of Northern Africa. The repeated attempts to destabilize our democracies, especially in our eastern EU partner countries, the support for radicals, the spread of fake news and disinformation. Putin's Russia is just awful, but we will have to try and cope with the situation, especially after the Russian Federation has destroyed the peace and security architecture which lasted even in the coldest weeks and months of the Cold War. The institutions, how are we going to have a future organization of the OSCE or the Council of Europe? How are we going to find some kind of diplomatic contacts between NATO and the Russian Federation? And also, what does this all mean for binding treaties which we shared, like the Paris Charter or the Final Act of Helsinki? So this will be a huge challenge for European and transatlantic foreign policy. And on China, we are waiting for the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Borrell, to present the updated EU-China strategy. And of course, we will have to reflect three things. I think the three English C's best describe how we deal with China here in Europe. We cooperate where possible, for instance, on climate change. We compete where needed. But if we want to have fair economic competition, we need a real level playing field, especially for our small and medium-sized enterprises. And all European companies who have been operating on the Chinese market know that there is no level playing field, that it's unfair. But of course, we also have to confront China. And what people underestimated in Europe was that we hoped that doing more trade with China would lead to democratic reforms. This has not materialized. China is a systemic rival, a geostrategic competitor, and we have to be very clear that we have very, very different views. Final point, we Europeans should try to, as closely as possible, coordinate our updated China strategy with our American and Canadian partners.
A quick question to you both. What do you believe China has understood from the war in Ukraine? And what do you believe Taiwan has learned from the war in Ukraine?
I believe that China has been following our reactions since the 24th of February extremely closely, and I think that the Chinese are impressed by the unity of the Western allies. We haven't seen such close cooperation between the EU, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, like we have seen since the 24th of February. The unity of the West, that was very important. And the second point is that the Chinese, much more than the Russians, of course, fear economic sanctions, because unlike the Russians, who can only sell gas, oil, and coal to us, and They're not really very interesting for us in Europe, what they produce on the market. Chinese have interesting products for us in Europe, just like we have interesting products for the Chinese markets. And that's why if we in Europe get our act together and combine our economic power we have with more political power, then I think we can also make a difference in dealing with China.
Senator?
Really well said. First of all, I don't think that the way you put the question, what have they learned, I don't think they're done learning yet. They're watching day by day. And more importantly, I think they're going to watch and see what happens after the fact. When this is over in Ukraine, it's not over. This is going to have a tail on it for a long, long time for the Ukrainians, for generations to come. I deal with them daily in D.C. and now there. These people are hurt, they're angry, and rightfully so, with the atrocities that have been committed by Russia. This is going to go on for a long, long time. In addition to that, because we did misjudge Russia and did a lot of things, we're going to be doing things differently. Our European friends are really we're quickly to the party to realize that their entire energy industry is going to have to be revisited and redone. And there's a lot of other things. There's 700 American companies that have withdrawn from Russia. They are not going to go rushing back in there. It's just not going to happen. So what happens after the fact, I think, is going to be very important. And certainly from a military aspect, China is watching that. But I think something that's probably lost on us is they're going to be looking at the fallout to Russia after this, after the shooting stops. And that fallout is going to be very, very dramatic over the long haul for Russia.
So you believe, Senator, there'll be real costs Sino-Russian alignment? I mean, that's the way it sounded to me. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, I'm not sure of that. You know, the Russians and the Chinese are not natural allies. Sometimes they act like it because they have things that they have in common, the way they think. But there's one thing we know about both of these countries, that people try to think of them in the same bucket, and they're two different fish. There's no question about it. You always, they're looking for upheaval. They're looking for incivility. They're looking to cause trouble. With the Chinese, just hang on to your wallet while you're talking to them, and everything will be okay. We can say one thing for sure about the Chinese that we know: they will always, always do what's right for China, regardless of whether it's right or wrong.
Mr. McAllister, at the G7 summit, there was a big announcement, a partnership for global infrastructure. This is, in some ways, to your point, relationship, the G7 countries trying to counterbalance Belt and Road. How do you judge or rate Europe's global gateway projects so far? The EU's answer to this. Do you think it is sufficient? Are we too late? That we've already allowed Chinese influence to grow in key markets? And then, Senator, I'll ask you, and then I want to bring others into the conversation.
Well, Global Gateway Europe was overdue.
Long overdue.
For many years, the European Parliament had said not only should we be complaining about the Belt and Road Initiative, but we have to offer an interesting alternative. And it took quite a while until the United States and Europe understood that infrastructure policy is always geopolitical when dealing with the Chinese. Now we have these alternatives. We're putting a lot of money on the table, and we have to do that. We have to convince our partners in Latin America, in Africa, and especially in the entire Indo-Pacific that cooperating with the United States and the European Union might be a little more challenging because we ask more about environmental standards, about human rights and other questions, but it's sustainable. And we don't want to create dependencies like the Chinese, and we don't want to exercise political influence on these countries, but we want to really bring the world together. And we in Europe are so dependent on an open and free access to the Indo-Pacific that we have our very own interest in supporting these infrastructure projects and combining this with our political ambitions. So I very much welcome that the G7 leaders have announced this additional funding, and we should invest it smartly. And we are already in a direct competition with China, and we've lost a lot of valuable time.
Absolutely. Quick question, Senator Risch, to you. As I'm on my way this evening to Madrid, we're hearing reports that the NATO strategic concept on China, according to Mr. Stoltenberg, that China will be termed a challenge to our interest, our security, and our values. Is that strong enough language for you from where you sit?
Probably. I think that it is important to understand how China plays into this. And all of this that's happened, I think in the years I've been doing this, I've never seen the Europeans and U.S. Closer. There was a horrible mistake that Putin made. I'm certain that he believed that an invasion of Ukraine would split NATO. That has done absolutely the opposite. And I don't think it's too late. You always have to make judgments based upon where you stand right now. And we've learned a lot about both China and Russia in the recent decade, and we need to adjust things in that regard. As the challenge that has been referred to here, that China is getting into all aspects of life in all countries, is a huge deal, and we have to respond to that. And as has been pointed out, we always have to offer, we can't just say no, we have to offer alternatives. And as has been pointed out, dealing with those of us that come from free and democratic societies where we don't believe in corruption, we don't believe in bribery, we value human rights really above all. For a lot of countries, this is a challenge, particularly ones that lean more towards autocracy than democracy. But that doesn't mean it can be ignored. It's got to be dealt with.
Well, I agree. Always provide a positive alternative. We learned that in the 5G debate as well. Okay, I want to take one question from this side and one question from this side, and we're going to do it rapid fire because I have 2 minutes. Kevin, we'll have the microphone back here, and ma'am right there. Okay. Kevin.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, a Pentagon-focused publication, national security publication. I wonder if you could both talk about how your constituencies, Americans, Europeans, view China and the battle over convincing them what to think about China. I've written a lot, reported a lot about how in the United States there is a bit of a battle of whether or not you can do business with China and still call yourself a patriot. We hear it a lot from the far right, a lot from the far left. So where are you on that spectrum, and what kind of message are you giving to your constituencies? Where do you think the people need to be, and how much does it really matter what the people think versus what, as you said, Senator, the leaders, people in the space think about China?
Okay, hold that. We're going to take one and very, very quick.
Hello, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you so much for your comments. Since this is supposed to combine transatlantic relations and the Indo-Pacific, we see that the Europeans have a very different perception of China. And what concrete ways do you see them working together on these issues? There's questions of burden shifting in regard to NATO, and how do we see Europe maybe picking up or some sort of division of labor in the Indo-Pacific? On a promising note, the incoming Czech presidency of the European Council on July 1st, they will have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So they're pushing that very hard. So this is a promising sign for a landlocked country. And I would say that France as well and Sweden will continue with the Indo-Pacific. But how do we work with the US and Europe together on this?
Thank you. Mr. McAllister, I'll turn to you first, and then Senator Risch, you can have the last word, please.
Okay, 2 comments on the Indo-Pacific. I very much welcome that the European Union for the first time presented its own EU Indo-Pacific strategy last year, after France, Germany and the Netherlands, who had their own national strategies for the first time. The EU has taken a united approach towards the region. And I think what is characterizing for this EU approach is it's inclusive. We try to bring cooperation to as many partners as possible in the region, but we've also set our priorities. It's the like-minded democracies, it's the like-minded partners who are our key partners in the region: Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, and also the countries of ASEAN. Here we see a lot of common ground. I think that apart from the economic aspects in the Indo-Pacific, we I welcome that now there's a closer angle on foreign and security-related issues. Not only is France the only European Indo-Pacific nation with the French overseas territories, but we've also seen some military presence now from the Germans, from the Dutch. I mean, of course, this is symbolic, but it shows the region. We in Europe have our very own interests, and we want to have an open and free access to the Indo-Pacific, safe maritime routes, especially in the South China Sea. So that's for one point. And the other point, how do our constituents perceive China? Well, luckily, I can travel home every weekend from Brussels to my hometown in North Germany. I spend a lot of time speaking to people. I've noticed in recent years how there's been a shift in my home country, Germany, towards China. It's much more critical than a few years ago. And I would say it was two events which actually changed the public debate. The one thing is Hong Kong, when the Chinese communists cracked the liberal movement in Hong Kong. That showed us that they are ideologically aggressive and that you cannot trust and rely on them. So a clear breach of all international agreements. And the other game changer was the outrageous reports from Xinjiang, how the Chinese are treating the Uyghurs. This is the most severe and systematic breach of human rights, I would say, in decades. And the world has been far too silent for far too long what the Chinese communists are doing here in the western provinces of China. So this has really changed the narrative. And if you look at the polls, Germans are much more in favor of us taking a more critical stance towards the communist leadership. So I think we're seeing more an alignment of US and European interests. Of course, two differences. We Europeans are not a Pacific nation apart from the French, so we don't have the immediate confrontation in the Pacific like our American allies and partners. And of course, we're doing more business with China, but also here I can see that more and more also big industrial firms in Germany are starting to question, what does this all mean for us if we get too dependent on the Chinese market?
Exactly. Senator Risch, you get the last word.
Could we get some easy questions on the next round?
These guys are really good. Sorry.
Let me try to be brief on both of those so we can get to as many questions as we can. When I wrote this report, it is really focused on the relationship between Europe and the United States and that relationship as it relates to China. Look, we have to do this together. There are about 650 million of us in Europe and the United States. China has about 1.5 billion people. We are greatly outmatched numerically. Having said that, individually, we are not going to be a match for the Chinese in the short run or the long run, for that matter. If we do this together, and we got a long ways to go if we're going to start pulling the cart together, but we have to pull the cart together. We have a whole lot more in common, obviously, than either of us do as far as the Chinese are concerned. So we really need to focus on that. We need to do more on that. We have our squabbles, as we've always had, and we'll always have that. Any kind of relationship has squabbles. We haven't been very good at resolving those sometimes. Boeing, Airbus as an example, and some others. But those are de minimis compared to the overall confrontation between China and us as a culture. So this has got to be done. As far as constituencies are concerned, the constituencies I think in the United States are much slower to get their arms around this than those of us that are on the front line fighting the battle. I agree completely that there are some things that have happened in China which have underscored this greatly, not the least of which is the treatment of the Uyghurs. I mean, look, that's how they treat all their people. It just got on the front pages because you had this great mass of people, and they were they were pushing back, and so the Chinese did what the Chinese do, and that is they can always be tougher, and they were. And people are going, what is this? How can this be happening in the 21st century? It's happening. It's real, and it's China.
Senator, thank you. Again, I shout out to a great report that is a great roadmap. I think we just heard the two taglines, strength and unity, and let's pull the cart together. Mr. McAllister, Senator Risch, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Please join me in thanking them. Quickly change the set, but thank you both so much, and please join me in welcoming virtually the Foreign Minister of Taiwan, Mr. Joseph Wu, as well as Senator Chris Murphy, and our very own Laura Thornton, who leads our Alliance for Securing Democracy. And we're going to keep digging into, again, the power of democracy as we think about these great challenges. So I will let everybody come on up. And of course, to moderate this great conversation, we have Bethany Allen Ibrahim of Axios, who's going to steer us through this great conversation. So thank you all to you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm looking forward to moderating this conversation today on democracy at home and abroad. We are looking at the way that China has interfered in democratic processes and the information environment in Taiwan, but not just Taiwan, in democracies around the world and in countries that are not democracies. And as of 2022, there's almost no country that has not been touched by China's economic coercion, its disinformation operations, its cyber operations. So today we'll be looking at what China is doing and how like-minded countries, how democracies can work together to push back against China and other rising nations with rising authoritarianism, most importantly right now, Russia. So first of all, I will have each of our panelists give a brief opening remarks, and then I will open up the conversation with some questions of my own, and I look forward to incorporating your questions as well. So now we will begin with Foreign Minister Wu.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important forum, especially talking about democracy home and abroad. Taiwan is a democracy, there's no doubt about it. If you look at all the indicators coming from the very notable institutions, Taiwan is a well-established democracy. But at the same time, we are also seeing that Taiwan democracy has been under threat, under the Chinese threat, military threat, or diplomatic isolation, and also the infiltration, as what Bethany said a little bit earlier, by infiltrating into our society, by hybrid threat, by cyber attack, or by cognitive warfare. And all these are designed to undermine Taiwan's democracy. And the way I see the world situation is that this is a confrontation in between democracy on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. And I think the authoritarianism is making its way out to the wide Pacific, and not only in the Pacific, but also in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and South America. And this is a trend that the fellow democracies need to pay attention to. And Taiwan happens to be another focal point other than the war in Ukraine. And we hope that we can get as many people to understand our situation so that we can continue to protect the democracy that we have fought so hard to establish. After all, democracy is something that is deep in our belief system. And we don't want anything or anybody or any country to take it away from us. And we have the determination to defend our own democracy, and we are prepared to defend our democracy. But at the same time, we need friends, and we need fellow democracies to pay attention to the situation Taiwan is in and to provide support for Taiwan as a democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Foreign Minister. Senator Murphy, I'll turn to you.
Well, I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation today, and wonderful to be with you, Mr. Minister. Listen, we share the concerns that you've raised about needing to support both American democracy and democracy of our partners at this moment of great threat. And it's no secret that right now, there is really a crisis of faith amongst those who live both in European democracies and in the United States. We had a convention last weekend in Texas of Republican activists in which they voted for a platform that calls for the end of direct election of the governor of Texas. You have a mainstream party asking for a withdrawal of rights from voters in one of the biggest states in this country. And it suggests that right now in the United States, there is a moment where a lot of voters are sort of questioning whether or not they are prepared to continue to invest in American democracy. And so this is a moment where we've got to take stock of both our strengths and our vulnerabilities and understand how the Chinese and the Russians take advantage of these questions that are being asked of our constituents to try to promote dissent from within. Several years ago, there was a bit of a tempest in American politics. A American football player by the name of Colin Kaepernick decided to kneel during the national anthem. And it became a controversy in the United States. It was lighting up social media, this question of whether it was patriotic or not to protest during the national anthem being played at a sporting event. Well, it turns out that, in fact, it was a tempest created from outside of the United States. 75 to 80% of the social media traffic on this question was driven by Russian and Chinese disinformation efforts. And so you have this ability today of outside actors to weaken, to make vulnerable European and American democracies. You have an inability of these democracies to deliver the kind of economic salvation, the kind of economic opportunity that is expected in these nations. And so this is this moment where we've got to bind together. We've got to have answers for these threats that are posed to democracies from the outside, but also we've got to have combined answers to deliver answers from the inside. So I think it's a moment where we shouldn't sugarcoat the questions that are being asked in Europe and in the United States about the efficacy of democracy in the long run. We shouldn't underplay the threats from the outside that we have to have answers for. And that's why convenings like this are so important, to share best practices, to be honest about the threats that are presented, and to make sure that we can rise to the moment.
Thank you so much, Senator. And Laura, now we'll turn to you for your remarks.
Sure. First of all, it's such an honor to be here. I am, by contrast, a mere democracy practitioner, but I have lived 25 years overseas and had a front row seat to the damage that autocracies can do to democracies, particularly where countries where democracy is weak. At the Alliance for Securing Democracy at GMF, we track the whole toolkit of autocrats. So information operations, malign finance, emerging technology, election subversion. And I've seen this play out. I lived in Cambodia for 7 years. It has basically become a vassal state of China. Sure, they built roads, they provided telecommunications, they also lined the pockets of the Hun Sen regime. They helped him subvert civil society and the political opposition. And they extracted natural resources. They built factories but didn't employ Cambodians. They built dams but exported the energy to Vietnam. And Cambodian people did not benefit. They also extract a huge geopolitical price. So Uyghurs who ended up in Phnom Penh were immediately sent back to Beijing. China also demands Cambodia's loyalty in the United Nations. So, we have to understand that democracy and the strength of our democracy is really also the solution. So Cambodia has a weak democracy, they were more vulnerable. I also lived in Indonesia, where it's slightly stronger democracy. And the things that they have in place are sort of the keys to our future. So parliamentary oversight, a strong civil society and media and opposition to advocate for export and import controls and sanctions and transparency to make sure that people that are investing in the country are following due diligence. And these are the kind of things that can protect us. And just to second what the senator said, we are our own worst enemy in terms of making ourselves vulnerable. If our own countries have weakened democratic resilience, if we have autocrats on our own ballots, and we are a victim of sort of disinformation poison, then we make their work very, very easy for them.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to launch right into our conversation portion, and I want to start with a question that has been on the front of anyone's mind who pays attention to China, and that is as Ukraine is to Russia, as Taiwan is to China, what has Taiwan learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I guess this is a question that I need to explore. And in fact, Taiwan has been exploring this question in an in-depth way. We try to learn as much as possible from this war so that Taiwan can be better prepared if another authoritarian country, that is China, wants to launch a war against Taiwan. I think there are several things we have been learning. The first is how we can understand more about this authoritarian country. And another thing is how we can learn from the war itself so that Taiwan can be better prepared. And three is how we can learn from the international reactions to this war so that we know how to work under this environment. The first is about understanding China. China does not hide its intention from expanding its role, from expanding its authoritarian influence. They have been operating in East China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, and they try to expand beyond the first island chain. The recent agreement signed between China and the Solomon Islands on the security agreement is something that has already awakened other countries in the Pacific. And if you look at the African countries, I think Europe, the United States, and Japan together make more investment in Africa. But the Chinese influence, the authoritarian influence in Africa is so much more than all these democracies combined. And if you look at South America, I'm sure Senator Murphy has a very strong attachment to this part of the world. Look at the leftist trend. I think they are more friendly to China these days than to the United States. So if you put all this together, we see a China that may be much more threatening to Russia than Russia. And what China can come up with its economic might or its military might can pose a direct threat to the US partners and allies in the West Pacific, including Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and etc. So this is what we see China. And the second is what we can learn from the war itself. We see the Ukrainians are very brave in defending their territory. They are preparing for their asymmetric warfare, and they procure their weapons for the asymmetric warfare skills. And that is something that we are learning as well. And we want to reform our military so that we can acquire that kind of capability. And we are also seeing the very brave Ukrainians picking up arms to defend the territory. And that is something that we are learning as well. And we want to reform our military so that all the men and women in Taiwan can defend ourselves. And third is we are seeing that the fellow democracies are united together to help the Ukrainians. And that is a lot of encouragement to a country like Taiwan, who is standing on the front line. And under this environment, we want to improve our relations with fellow democracies so that they can understand Taiwan more and can show support to Taiwan when we need it.
As a follow-up to that, I think that China and Russia were both perhaps surprised by the strength of the Western reaction and response to Russia's invasion. Foreign Minister Wu, do you think that this has served as a deterrent to China in a potential invasion or assault against Taiwan in the short to medium term at least?
Yes, it's a very strong deterrence, and that is something that we see as a very powerful deterrence against the potential aggression by China against Taiwan. So what we see is the European countries and the United States, Japan, Canada, Australia, and etc. That are more united than any moment that I have seen in the past few decades. And I think this is a very strong indicator to the Chinese government that any kind of aggression against another democracy is going to provoke a reaction similar to what the fellow democracies have done against Russia. And of course, if Taiwan is attacked unprovoked, our hope is that the fellow democracies can rally around Taiwan and to deter the Chinese or to fight against the Chinese. And so far, we have been discussing with the U.S. government to see how we can reach this goal so that there are more democracies can find Taiwan as a force for good and worth supporting.
Thank you. Senator Murphy, one thing that has been fairly constant, I would say surprisingly, over the past 5 years is that bipartisanship in the US, which is an endangered species perhaps, has remained constant, fairly constant regarding China and the threat that China poses not just to US national interests, but to democracy at large. Why does there remain such a strong bipartisanship? And what would you say are the main goals that members of Congress have in terms of US-China relations and the transatlantic China relationship?
Well, it's a good point. For as much as we fight over in the United States Congress, there is frankly a growing consensus, and I credit Senator Risch in part for helping to develop this consensus around U.S. policy towards China. We passed in the United States Senate an extraordinary piece of legislation late last year. We call it our competitiveness bill, but it is a piece of legislation that finally understands that there is no way for the United States to compete with China without a domestic industrial policy, that we are going to have a deeper integration of public and private sector in order to compete with China's strategy of midwifing technologies domestically through subsidy and direct integration of the public and private sector, and then unleashing them on the world at a cost that the private sector cannot compete with. And so in our legislation, we seek to first build that public-private partnership around the microchip industry to say that it is just mission critical for the United States to be able to have that capability here in the United States, to be able to own it in the long run. And we were able to do that with Democratic and Republican support. This is something that Republicans have been generally anathema to, big public sector investment in traditionally private sector industries. But this model is going to have to be expanded to look at, advanced battery technology, artificial intelligence, all of the sort of world-dominating technologies of the next 50 years that China is seeking to monopolize. And we've got to do this in consultation and coordination with Europe. It doesn't make sense for the United States alone to have a microchip strategy. We should be doing that together with the European Union. And I would argue that towards the question you posed first to the minister, that as we learn lessons from Russia and Ukraine, one of them is that we did not unwind the West's dependence on Russia in anticipation of this conflict. Russia made a bet that we needed them more than they needed us. And you have seen their oil revenues continue to spike because in the short run, Europe couldn't unlock itself from that dependence. We've got to do the hard work now to take a look at critical industries and critical supply chains and at least create the capability for the West to be able to make ourselves independent. So if that conflict does come, China doesn't sort of have that sword of Damocles sitting over the West. We've got to make sure that on critical technologies, we have, between the United States and Europe and Taiwan and Asian democracies, the ability to make for ourselves what we need to power our economies. That's a lesson that we frankly should learn from the continued energy dominance of Russia over Europe that has lasted past the invasion of Ukraine.
Your raising the economic issue is incredibly important, and economic coercion is a key foundation of China's power. It doesn't yet have the kind of military strength that Russia does. Very interestingly, last year, Europe saw this on its home turf with the way that China levied tariffs on, not tariffs, with the way that China blocked imports from Lithuania. Right. So I would like to also, I guess, ask all three of you, how do you see specifically new mechanisms, new institutions, new promises, both within the EU and between the EU and the US, to help protect smaller countries like Lithuania and to even serve as a sort of economic deterrent on China and Russia for this kind of economic coercion? And perhaps, Senator, we can start with you.
No, I'd be happy to start. I mean, I think some of that answer is rooted in my previous comments around building these sort of economic systems that are built amongst democratic nations to make sure that we have supply chain capabilities so that if China threatens to cut a nation off, we have an answer inside the democratic alliance. The second piece of this is being able to, have real offers available from democratic nations and the United States for infrastructure development. Yeah. Often for small countries, China provides the only answer, right? If you're trying to develop a port, China may be the only significant and suitable bidder. That's unacceptable. So the United States has begun to supersize our international economic development aid programming. We've consolidated a lot of our siloed programs into a new entity called the DFC. But we've got to do better in competing with China for infrastructure opportunities around the globe. We've got to do better in working with Europe to make sure that when it comes to developing nations, we have answers for them that compete with Chinese offers. So far, we have been letting China play on that field largely alone, and our efforts to scale up and compete have been far too long in the making.
And Laura, you've seen this, China's economic influence on the ground in countries in Southeast Asia, and so I'll pose the same question to you.
Yes, I mean, I agree with what the senator said. I also think, in large part, it's a messaging problem as well. And just if I could pick up on one of the minister's points, is understanding the difference in objectives between different autocratic actors. So they share some. So Russia and China both, for example, want to undermine democracy and, point out Western hypocrisy, et cetera. Russia's more into throwing chaos and sort of sowing distrust and conflict, whereas the minister said China has a very long-term objective and geopolitical goals. And one of that is to establish an alternative global governance order and to establish these economic and diplomatic dependencies. So I think that they are winning, in a way, a war of narratives as well, because they sell themselves as, we provide economic development with no strings attached. We are not going to talk to you about human rights or your democracy credentials. Of course, they have enormous strings, as I just outlined in what I experienced living in Thailand and Cambodia and even the country Georgia, where they have a deputy minister on the payroll of a Chinese company and are building out the port and didn't participate in competitive bidding. So I think we need to do a better job of explaining, the strings that are attached, why there's a difference between the World Bank and BRI, who's meeting transparency requirements, who's following due diligence procedures, who's getting approval from, democratically elected parliaments, and then providing that, being there to provide 5G to compete with China and being there to make up those differences. If there is no one building the port, then we're lost.
Minister, I'll pose this question to you. Taiwan is has been dealing with China's economic coercion in, I would say, two different ways. First of all, as a target of that directly. Very interestingly, Taiwan was perhaps one of the earliest countries to pull back against closer economic integration with China about a decade ago with the Sunflower Movement that was against a free trade agreement. And Taiwan is also the reason that other countries experience China's economic coercion, as the case of Lithuania and other cases. What has Taiwan learned as a nation that's much smaller than China and yet has continued to be independent? What have you learned about pushing back against economic coercion? And what advice would you give and what would you hope to see from other democratic nations?
This is a very good question, but I don't know whether I have a good answer for it. If you look at economic dependency, many people would describe that Taiwan's economy seems to be highly dependent on the Chinese economy. Look at our export. About 40% of our export goes to China, and about 25% of the import comes from China. And therefore, the calculation is that Taiwan is dependent on the Chinese market. But at the same time, Taiwan is a democracy, and therefore, we cannot tell our businessmen that you cannot go to China. You should go to Southeast Asia or India instead. And I think there's a natural logic that the businessmen in Taiwan, they have been considering. And when they see that China is still profitable, they will stay in China. But when the business environment has changed, they want to move somewhere else. And I think this is the trend that we see in the last few years. When the Chinese business environment is not as good as before, when the labor situation is not as stable as before, when the environmental policy that Chinese government is pursuing is not conducive to the business environment, and the political situation and the overall economic situation seem to be undergoing a new phase, an unstable phase. The businessmen of Taiwan origin operating in China, they want to migrate out. A lot of them come back to Taiwan, and a lot of them want to go to Southeast Asia and India and South America instead. So this is a natural trend over there. But I think want to go back to the earlier questions about the Chinese using economy as a leverage against other countries. That is something that we are very concerned about. Because of the economic dependency or interdependence in between Taiwan and China economically, many people here in Taiwan are very concerned if China uses economic leverage to go against Taiwan together with military. That might be a serious problem for Taiwan. But fortunately, the Taiwanese businessmen, even though they make a lot of investment in China, they also understand technology is the key. They need to hold the key technologies in Taiwan, even though they make investment in China. And therefore, China does not have the kinds of technologies to cut Taiwan off. So this is something that we try to protect ourselves. And economic coercion is something that is not a stranger to Taiwan. Just a few days ago, the Chinese announced a sanction against Taiwan's fishery product. And last year, the Chinese government also sanctioned against Taiwan's agricultural products, pineapple and etc. And we understand that this is something that we have to deal with. But Taiwan is not alone in dealing with the situation. You know, Lithuania is another one, Australia or the Czech Republic. And under this kind of situation, the only recommendation I would make is for the democracies to unite and support each other. The way we try to support the Australians is that in a dinner banquet hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taiwan, we use the Australian wine. We do it until today. We want to make sure that the Australian government understands the Taiwanese government is fully behind them. And the same with Lithuania. The Taiwanese people just go out to the market to buy off the Lithuanian products, whether it's chocolate or beer or other type of products. And that is the way to show support to each other. That's my belief, that as long as the democracies can unite, we can ward off the kinds of economic pressure or economic coercion by the authoritarian force.
Thank you for that. I'd like to remind everyone that we welcome your questions. Oh, many questions. First one I saw right here.
Hi, my name's Sandra from Keeping Channels Open, a new dialogue forum. I wanted to ask the Minister, what does Chinese disinformation look like in Taiwan? What are the themes, the targets? What are they trying to do with that? And, you know, for the Senator and Laura, you know, what can be done in terms of public diplomacy and strategic communications to counter Chinese narratives on Ukraine?
Well, I'll give a brief answer to that outstanding question. Disinformation campaign is something that we face day in and day out. And it's not only disinformation, but also cognitive warfare. The Chinese are trying to play the narratives to make us believe that the United States is abandoning Taiwan, the United States is not going to help Taiwan, and Taiwan is doomed unless Taiwan go out to China for help. So this is the kind of situation we are facing. And what the Chinese wants to do is to undermine Taiwan's democracy so that Taiwan's people do not trust the Taiwanese government. And if we do not do anything over this, I think Taiwan's democracy is going to be undermined. And the things that we feel so proud to establish our democracy is no longer be functionable. But I think what we try to do is to ask the government institutions, every institution, to respond to every piece of this disinformation in a very quick way. You know, for example, if we detect a piece of information that is not accurate, we are required to come out and clarify it as soon as possible. And for the government clarification is not good by itself. We need to work together with media. So there are friendly media with the Taiwanese government who want to publish what the government is trying to clarify. And we also work together with the NGOs. The NGOs set up those fact-check institutions or fact-check centers. They allow the regular people to send their question or information in to verify whether that is true or not. And I think other than that, we also have institutions that is tracking the origin and alerting the people or educating the people to be media literate. And they are able to read what is right and what is wrong coming out of media or social media platforms. So this is what we try to do. Without working together in between the government and the people and the NGOs, it would have been very difficult for Taiwan to deal with the disinformation issue.
Laura.
Yeah, so I could probably talk about combating disinformation for hours. I'll try to keep it short. First, on the issue of the war in Ukraine, it has been fascinating to see how China has come in to amplify messages of Russia. And just to give you one example, we had a sort of perfect experiment in the French elections because during the French elections, there was a ban on RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik. And what we saw was just how the gap was filled by China. And all the narratives from, you know, the denazification to drug-addled leadership to bioweapons labs to, you know, liberating Ukraine, all the same narratives were coming out. So it's a little bit like squeezing a water balloon. You can try to stop it here, but it's going to come out there, and China's really helped to amplify that. They've also played a great role in amplifying Russia's agenda in the global south. The food crisis is the fault of the West. That's why it's not happening. And oh, look at this aggressive security pact in NATO, and we need to create alternative security pacts, et cetera. As for solutions, I mean, I think the minister outlined some of them. And I think we can learn from the Ukrainians, in fact. Instead of just the whack-a-mole sort of fact-checking, we also need to do the preemption and getting ahead of the narrative and the prediction. And Ukraine really led the way in a lot of ways in sort of foreshadowing, this is what you're going to hear. And the US helped by releasing intelligence so that we were able to get ahead of certain narratives. Also investing more in prediction. So it's less about sort of what the narratives are, but what are the patterns? What can we learn about the tactics so that we can recognize them going ahead? And then I think, as the minister also said,
we need to deal with the demand side. I mean, disinformation is because we consume it. And so what do we do about we, the people, who seek out a diet of disinformation and conspiracy theories? And I think, and you know, I could talk at length about this needs to go beyond media literacy. I mean, we need to develop sort of a more discerning populace. And that is going to mean strengthening local media at the grassroots level, communities at the grassroots level, civic education, experiments in civil service and other things to sort of pull people together across their information bubbles. So it's going to take a sort of supply and demand approach to really handling this.
I would just say a few things about this. First, the U.S. has capacities to deal with misinformation that we dramatically underfund. You know, we make a decision to fight this battle with one hand tied behind our back. Senator Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, and I, years ago, established something called the Global Engagement Center, which is a new capacity inside the Department of State that seeks to fund independent organizations all around the world, basically on Russia's periphery and China's periphery, that are truth tellers, that are fact checkers, that are telling stories of objective journalism. But we put a pittance of money into that program. One quarter of the cost of an aircraft carrier, right? Despite the fact that I would argue misinformation is a bigger threat to the United States and our friends than conventional militaries are today. And so we just got to make a decision to resource these efforts. Two, in the United States today, social media is a misinformation dumpster fire. And we've got to make a decision as to whether we are going to allow these companies to continue to make no discriminations between what is real and what isn't. They have immunity, for instance, in the United States. They have no legal liability for allowing deliberate misinformation to be spread on their platforms. We can make a different decision. And then lastly, this is a really difficult issue to deal with in the United States because it gets politicized very, very quickly. So the Department of Homeland Security, about a month ago, decided to just better coordinate its misinformation efforts domestically. And so they set up a capacity just to have people that are currently working on domestic misinformation talk to each other. Now, they gave it a kind of ominous sounding name, the Disinformation Governance Board, but it became this hot button issue in which Republicans claimed that it was an effort to try to control individual Americans' free speech rights. And within a month, it was disbanded. And so any time that we try to dip a toe into this space, it often gets shouted down by people who see a political advantage in claiming that talking about this issue of misinformation is in fact an insidious, under-the-cover effort to control Americans' free speech. So we've got political challenges, we've got funding challenges, we've got policy challenges. All of them are overcomable. All of them have answers. We've just got to make the decision to try to fix the problems.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? I mean, I think, so first of all, in the public diplomacy, absolutely. So we have 1/10 the following on VOA as Russia Today, Espanol, in South and Central America. Getting out ahead is also that communicating a message, not fact sheets of 10 points long, but digging into the creative and emotional methods that are used by our adversaries. TikToks instead of fact sheets, memes, comedy. We need to get ahead of that, but also on trusting government. So we've seen success in countering misinformation from our Nordic friends, but they're able to do these sort of government-led, whole-of-society approaches because they're not going to be accused of doing an Orwellian, like the Disinformation Board in Pornina. So unfortunately, for government to take the lead on these things, there has to be sort of less polarization, more trust and faith in government. So it puts countries like the US at a slight disadvantage for some of this.
We'll go to the next question, which was right here.
My question is for Senator Murphy. My name is Dania Khatib. I'm from Research Center for Cooperation and Peace Building, Beirut. The general impression for policymakers in the Middle East, as well for the general public, that authoritarian regimes are more reliable, where democracies like the US and Europe are inconsistent. They are with you when you are winning, and they leave you when you are losing. And look at Assad, for example. Russia has been consistently supporting Assad, so did Iran. Iran supported Assad even even when he was losing. Where look at the U.S. policy towards Syria, it went from maximum pressure during Trump to frozen conflict during Biden. So my question to you, Senator Murphy, how can the West convince them otherwise, that the West can be trusted and can be a reliable partner? Thank you.
So listen, I take your critique seriously, and I think we have got to do a better job in the United States of maintaining consistency in foreign policy from administration to administration. You have seen some, fairly dramatic swings, especially in the Middle East over the course of the transition between Obama to Trump to Biden. At the same time, that is what comes with democracy and self-determination, right? The people get a say. And so if you want to align yourself with a democracy, you're going to have to understand that there may be swings in policy, because ultimately that is the result of voters getting to make different decisions. But we also have to do a better job of explaining how some things, especially in the Middle East, continue from administration to administration, despite the fact that the people of Lebanon may believe that Hezbollah provides more support and Iran provides more support to them in the United States. That is in fact not true. The United States remains the #1 humanitarian donor in Lebanon, but we are out-messaged by countries that are able to essentially cement themselves as the hand that is feeding, when the United States taxpayers are actually doing much more. So there are pieces of our policy in the region, like our humanitarian commitment, that frankly have not had radical changes, and we've got to do a better job of explaining.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Timothy Gartnash, Oxford University. First of all, Senator, thank you so much for your very frank opening remarks about the state of American democracy. I think self-criticism, the capacity for self-criticism, is one of the great strengths of democracy. My question is this: what do we do about the world's largest democracy, India, where in large part, not entirely, but in large part, people are essentially supporting the Russian side on the war in Ukraine, not just because of Russian weapons, but simply impervious to what seems to me the obvious point, that the Ukrainians are fighting a war of independence against the Russian Raj?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll be happy to start. I think what's important for us is to sort of show India a future for them that allows them to be more deeply integrated with the United States and other partners. And so a continued investment in the Quad and building out the Quad's capabilities and perhaps membership beyond a sort of simple defense and security alliance, I hope it gives the Indian government confidence that they will be able to find more security and economic partners amongst the community of democracies. Obviously, right now, India's got a great deal in that they are getting a pretty underpriced asset in energy exports from Russia, given the lack of available outlets for Russia and Europe and the United States today. And we're going to try to help India sort of manage through that opportunity without overinflating the value to Russia. But I think India will be able to see, as we grow the capabilities of the Quad, as we continue to deepen the U.S.-India relationship, the value of this deepening partnership, but there's still a lot of work to do there.
Do the other two panelists have any final remarks you'd like to make on that question, or others? Well, okay.
Well, certainly, just quickly to add, I mean, India is something that concerns us from a democracy point of view as well. And it also points out that this democracies, autocracies divide isn't always perfect, right? We assume, for example, I mean, Singapore joined the sanctions. They're not a democracy. India, we rely on to be our democratic partner in the Indo-Pacific, and yet have rising illiberal populism in the country within. So I do agree with the senator that we need to sort of make the case, particularly since India has also taken the lead on sort of a new non-aligned movement and what that would mean for sort of global order. So I think pulling close, showing the benefits, building the sort of democracy community will be important.
Well, that wraps up our panel for today. Thank you all for joining us, and I believe lunch is next.